She was counting the squares on the linoleum when the blue windbreakers appeared in the doorway, and the woman at the front desk said a name that sounded like hers, but not quite, the way loud rooms do to small children. The backpack strap bit into her shoulder. She looked for her mother's hand and found only air. If a hallway can swallow a voice, what do you hold on to when your name is the only thing you have? Before we begin, if stories like this matter to you, please subscribe, leave a like, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments which moment stays with you the longest. Thank you. Let's go on. The apartment smelled like wet laundry and cinnamon. Mornings were a braid of small rituals, shoes lined up like polite soldiers by the door, a bowl of oatmeal with too much sugar, the sound of a bus sighing at the curb on 23rd Street in Brownsville, Texas. Her name was Alma. She was 7½, which is to say she was 7 with very serious opinions about halves. On school days, her father tucked a note into her lunch that said things like "Be brave" in tiny block letters. Her mother drew a heart around the date in the calendar whenever there was a library day. At night, the three of them fell asleep to the hum of a window unit that was too small for the room and to a radio station that always played one song too loud. No one said goodbye that morning. No one knew they needed to. At the clinic, where Alma was being weighed for a free checkup, a woman in a jacket with 4 letters stood near the door and spoke into a radio without moving her mouth. Another woman put a hand on Alma's mother's elbow and said, "Mom, we need a word." And the room changed temperature. Alma watched her mother's face try on several expressions at once. Polite confusion, the sturdy smile she kept for strangers, a quick check toward the hallway where Alma stood clutching the strap of her backpack. The nurse called a number that was also the name of a family. A printer somewhere coughed. Outpaper. The blue jackets formed a careful, quiet shape around the small waiting room, where magazines about gardens lay open to pictures of flowers no one in the room had time for. They asked for identification, the way people ask the time. Alma's father stepped from the hallway with sleeves rolled to his forearms and a face that said, "Please let this be a misunderstanding." He offered a card that proved he had taken a safety class and a lease with his name almost spelled right. "Sir, we're going." "To need you to come with us," the woman said, in a voice that had practiced sounding like a couch cushion. Alma watched her father look at her mother, then at her, then back at the woman. He nodded like a person agreeing to sit for a haircut he didn't want. "She is 7, her mother said, as if the number might unlock a softer version of the world. The woman nodded. "We know," she said, and then everything that followed was made of doors and clipboards, and the sound of pens clicking at the wrong time. Alma learned the shape of a van door handle from the inside. She learned the way light looks through glass with a grate over it. She learned that adults can whisper too loudly. The facility where they took her smelled like disinfectant and paper towels and something tired. There were cots lined up like notes on a staff. A woman with hair the color of the pencil Alma used for math asked her to write her name on a sticker and then wrote it again in bigger letters. "Do you know your parents' phone number?" she asked. Alma nodded and recited it, then recited it again, as if the first version might have been a dream's mistake. The woman's mouth made a thin line. "We'll call," she said, and handed Alma a clear bag with a comb, a toothbrush, and a tiny tube of toothpaste that tasted like mint and hospitals. The hours in that place did not stack like regular hours. They slid around each other like soap. Alma made friends with a girl whose braids were too tight and with a boy who cried loud, and then soft, and then silently, staring at a spot on the wall where the paint had peeled to the shape of a cloud. Volunteers came with clipboards and smiles that had learned to be careful, and one of them, a college student with a backpack full of crayons, asked Alma to draw her house. Alma drew windows with curtains and a cat, even though they didn't have a cat. She drew a blue rectangle for the radio because sometimes you draw the things that keep you company, even when no one asks. They moved Alma to a shelter with brighter lights and a mural of birds in a hallway that smelled like lemons. The beds were still lined up, but the sheets had pictures of stars. A woman with a flower embroidered on her sleeve spoke Spanish that sounded like home, and English that sounded like a door you could push open if you really needed to. "Mi amor, vamos a localizar a tu papás," she said. "We're going to find your parents." Alma nodded, because nodding is one of the few ways children can feel like they are steering. On the third night, a call came through to a phone on a desk, and the woman with the flower sleeve held the receiver like a teacup that might spill. She passed it to Alma, and the voice on the other side was her mother's, but smaller, as if the distance had scraped some of the sound off. They spoke in sentences made of reassurance and swallowed questions. "We're okay," her mother said. "We're okay today." Alma told her about the birds on the wall and about a volunteer who had shoes that squeaked. Her mother laughed a laugh that broke in the middle, then stitched itself back together because laughter is also a job. There were meetings in rooms with whiteboards where people wrote her name and drew boxes around it with arrows to words like reunification and sponsor and verified. There were papers that needed other papers to prove the first papers were not alone. A counselor with gentle eyes and a planner big enough to double as a pillow taught Alma to count breaths into her hands when the room began to tilt. 5 in, 5 out, she said. Every breath is a small yes. Alma tried. She added a quiet 6th breath because odd numbers felt unlucky now. There were kindnesses too, the kind that never make it into reports. A security guard who started bringing an orange in his pocket for her at night shift change because he'd noticed she ate around the edges of her dinner but finished the fruit. A custodian who let her push the mop bucket down the hallway once, her small shoes squeaking so she could feel the pleasure of making a clean path that stayed clean for at least a few minutes. A librarian who came on Thursdays with a rolling cart of books and whose favorite trick was to pretend the books were heavy, even though the cart had very good wheels. Time moved in circles until it didn't. Papers aligned, names matched. A decision arrived in a sentence that did not know it was a decision, but acted like one. Alma would be transferred for reunification. Not here, not there, but away. To family waiting in Guatemala City until the adults could unthread the rest of the knots. The counselor knelt to look her in the eyes. "You will fly," she said, voice like a quilt. "Some very serious people will walk you through the airports. They will hold a folder with your name. You will hold on to yourself. Airports are a special kind of strange when you are 7 and your feet do not reach the floor of the seat. The plane windows made circles of sky. The folder in this serious person's hands had her name in block letters on the front, and inside it papers that smelled like ink and something plastic. The woman in the next seat asked if Alma wanted the cookie that came with the soda, and Alma said no, because sometimes saying no is how you remember who you are. When the wheels touched down, the serious person smiled, and Alma almost smiled back, until she remembered she had promised herself she would save the next smile for a door that opens to a voice she knows. Guatemala City is a dictionary of noises. The air at the arrivals hall was thick with a kind of hope that wears cheap cologne. The serious person led her past men holding signs and a woman selling gum and a boy with a plastic trumpet who was very committed to his craft. And then she saw them, not a movie running reunion like rain in a music video, a real one. Her father with a haircut too short, eyes raw around the edges. Her mother holding a bag too tightly, the knuckles white, and then colour returning as she let it go to open her arms. They all said each other's names at the same time, so the sound made no sense, and all the sense A security guard coughed the way people cough when they are pretending they are not crying. Someone behind them clapped because humans cannot help but applaud endings that looked like beginnings. The apartment in Zone 7 smelled like laundry and cumin instead of cinnamon. The window unit was a fan this time, stubborn and brave. The stairs to the door had a crack shaped like lightning. The radio station played marimba in the morning and ballads at night and commercials at every other minute. Alma learned a new route to school, holding her mother's hand tight for the first week, and then a little looser, because hands also need to breathe. The principal shook her father's hand and wrote her name carefully in a ledger that had held 1,000 names before hers. The classroom had a poster of volcanoes and a jar of pencils so sharp they looked like they could write songs. There were hard days. The neighborhood had corners where men watched too carefully, and a bus route that was famous for being late for reasons no one liked to explain. The faucet worked after you negotiated with it. The electricity argued with itself on damp nights. Alma woke more than once, with her heart running as if she had been late to something important in a dream. She counted breaths into her hands, 5 in, 5 out, and sometimes 6, because habits that bring you back are worth carrying. There were also days that tasted like mango and chalk dust. Alma found a library with a map of the world where she could trace with her finger from Texas to here and back, and whisper the names of places like promises. A teacher named Leti noticed how Alma watched the clock and made her line leader so that watching could become a job instead of a fear. At the market, a woman wrapped a bracelet around Alma's wrist and said, "Para suerte," for luck, and Alma kept it on. Until the string gave up and the beads rolled into a story she would tell later. Her parents did what adults do when the ground moves. They built a floor out of hours. Her father found work repairing gates and hinges, the click of a latch a small version of justice. He came home with hands that smelled like oil and a smile that learned to return to his face without apology. Her mother started helping at a community kitchen that tasted like the best parts of being poor, the part where everyone throws in a little and somehow there is enough. On Sundays, they walked to the park and brought a bag of stale bread for the ducks and talked about nothing in particular, which is a luxury you don't understand until you've lost it once. And then a letter arrived with a crest in the corner and a postmark that looked like it had traveled through 4 kinds of weather. It was from a lawyer Alma had never met, but who had met the file that had once been her stand-in. It used words like status and petition and determination in sentences that tried very hard to be unemotional and failed a little. There would be a chance to apply from here, it said, for something that might allow a return later, not as a half-shadow, but as a person on a seat with a ticket and a plan. They would need affidavits, they would need patience, they would need to remember that paper time is both slow and inexorable. They assembled the pieces like a puzzle you work on a small table, photos that made the days look better than they felt. School records, letters from teachers who had learned to love Alma's quiet intensity, a note from the counselor in Texas who had taught her to breathe. They took the bus to the consulate on a morning that smelled like rain and hope, and they stood in a queue that was 2 languages and 3 kinds of silence. When it was their turn, a woman behind glass looked at a screen, and then at them, and then at the screen again, the way people do when a story is fighting to be seen. She asked questions that were not cruel, only precise. When she said, "Thank you," at the end, Alma pressed her braceletless wrist to the glass because she wanted the cool to remind her of what holding on felt like. Waiting, again, but waiting with a different posture. The waiting that comes after the worst part has already happened, and you have the proof of survival in a bright string of ordinary days. Alma learned to ride a bike with handles that shook until they didn't. She learned the names of 3 kinds of clouds, and how to tell a chicken who didn't want to be caught that it wasn't about her, it was about dinner. She learned that you can be from two places without being divided into halves, as long as you carry both like two pockets full of stones that keep you from blowing away. One afternoon, while Alma and her mother were peeling potatoes at the community kitchen and the radio was arguing with itself about a soccer match, the phone on the wall rang like a bell in a school you don't attend but can hear from your window. The coordinator answered, and then beckoned with two fingers that seemed very calm for what they were doing. "Papers were ready," she said, in that tone adults use when they are trying not to cry. There would be a path, maybe crooked, but real. It might be months, it might be a year, but the map had lines now instead of blank space. Alma's mother sat down on a crate and laughed that broken fixed laugh again, and Alma leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and counted breaths into the fabric of her shirt. The next season arrived on schedule in a way that felt like a gift. Alma grew taller the way children do when you're busy concentrating on something else. Her father learned the names of his customers' dogs and stopped flinching when a knock came at the door. The kitchen hung a new sign no one could afford, but which a teenager had painted anyway. "Hoy tambien comemos, today we also eat." The consulate called and then called again, and the date on the calendar started to look less like ink and more like a door. On the morning of the interview, they dressed as if for a photograph. Alma wore a skirt that made her feel like the underline in a sentence. The bus driver nodded as if he had been carrying people to days like this his whole career and was glad to be part of it. In the room with the glass, the woman from before asked the same questions and some new ones. And Alma's father answered in a voice that had learned how to be steady, even when the floor moved. When it was over, the woman didn't smile with her mouth. She smiled with the way she returned the papers to their folder, carefully, as if she understood that paper, like people, keeps its shape better when it is held with kindness. Months later, because months are stubborn, the envelope arrived with the kind of authority that makes air pause. Alma held it as if it were a bird you want to show to your friends, without scaring it away. They opened it on the table with the wobble in one leg, the leg her father kept saying he would fix and never did, because some imperfections have become part of the family. The words were not poems. They did not need to be. They were enough. There would be a return, legal and ordinary, which is the best kind of extraordinary. But the story's victory wasn't stamped on a page. It had been happening all along. In the days when a small girl learned to breathe on command and to draw radios and birds and doors that opened. In the nights. When parents discovered that fear can be worn down by the sandpaper of routine, in the kindness of oranges in a pocket and wheels on a book cart and counselors who know how to kneel without making a ceremony of it. If you found something here that felt like your own breath coming back, if a hallway in this story looked like one you've walked, or a sentence felt like a hand on your shoulder, tell us which moment stayed with you the longest, and whose name you would hold steady in your mouth if the room got too loud. And if you are the kind of person who keeps a fruit in your pocket for a child you don't know yet, keep doing that. The world changes in those ounces. The rest is just paperwork catching up.